had been driving since late afternoon, running my hours out on the highway with the kind of focus that only comes from staring at the same lines and taillights for hours on end. By the time I was reaching the end of my clock, the sky was black, the moon was full and sitting high above the fields, and I knew I'd need to park soon to get my 10 in. Truck stops in that stretch were either jammed full or way too far apart, and I had already passed up the last decent one because I figured I'd push just a little farther. That gamble cost me because when I finally hit the red line on my hours, the only real option was a wide exit ramp shoulder where a few rigs had clearly parked before. It wasn't ideal, but at 3 a.m., with nothing but cornfields around me, I figured it was good enough. I set my brakes, did a quick walk around, and settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet night. The ramp was dead still. No rumble of traffic except a car flying by maybe once every 10 minutes. No light except for the pale wash of the moon and the dim red glow of my dash. I cracked my window a little to let in some air. The night had that dry, late-season chill to it, the kind where every sound seems sharper, and the cornfields that stretched out past the ramp had already been cut down to stubble. The landscape looked flat and endless in that silver light. That was when I noticed it. Out in the field, maybe 100 yards from the road, was a figure. It stood upright, stiff, too far away to make out any details, but the outline was human. At first my stomach gave a little jolt, like it was warning me before my brain even caught up. Then I told myself it had to be a scarecrow. Old farmers still put those up, maybe even for decoration. I forced the unease down and wrote it off. It wasn't moving, and in my head, I pictured some grandpa putting it up for the grandkids earlier that day. I climbed back into the sleeper, got my phone out, and started letting YouTube run while I settled. The glow from the screen felt comforting in the otherwise dark cab. I half-watched a few random videos, the sound low, and started to relax. That was when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Just the faintest impression of motion outside the windshield. I froze and turned my head slowly, trying not to spook myself. Through the glass, lit only by the moon, the figure was still there in the field. Except something felt different. I stared at it longer than I wanted to, trying to convince myself I was wrong. I couldn't be sure, but I thought it might be in a slightly different spot. Maybe closer. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and told myself I was tired. The shadows could be playing tricks. I shut off my interior lights and leaned forward, pressing my forehead to the cool glass so I could see better into the dark. The figure was still standing, stiff, alone in that field. I sat there for a while, longer than I should have, watching. It didn't move. Still, the unease grew. The ramp was silent, dead silent, the kind of silence that makes you more aware of your own heartbeat. A semi roared by on the main highway, then disappeared, leaving me in that hollow quiet again. My chest felt tight, like the night itself was pressing down on me. I tried to focus on my phone, but I couldn't shake it. And then, just as my bladder reminded me how long I'd been sitting, I realized I had no choice but to get out. I considered using a bottle, something I'd done plenty of times before when I didn't feel like climbing down. But part of me didn't want to admit I was spooked over something that was probably nothing more than a wooden post and some old clothes stuck in a field. I told myself I was being foolish. I could handle walking between my truck and trailer for 30 seconds. Before stepping out, I looked again through the windshield. The figure was still there, in the same place I had fixed it in my mind. I nodded to myself, like I just won an argument, and opened the door. The metal steps clanged under my boots louder than I wanted, the sound carrying in the stillness. The air outside was cold, sharper than I expected, and smelled faintly of dirt and old cut stalks from the field. I walked to the narrow space between the tractor and the trailer, shielded from the highway. I unzipped and started to pee, the sound loud in the quiet night. But my brain wouldn't let me rest. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn and look. I clenched my teeth, trying to focus on the ground, telling myself over and over not to give in. My heart thumped in my chest like it wanted out. I lasted maybe 5 seconds before I couldn't take it anymore. I looked out past the end of the trailer, eyes drawn to the field. My stomach dropped instantly. The figure was gone. The field was empty. The open stretch of pale, stubbled ground lay bare under the moonlight. No shape, no shadow, Nothing. My bladder seized up and I cut myself off midstream. I didn't care. Panic surged through me, pure and hard. I shoved myself back together, spun, and ran for the cab. My boots thudded on the pavement, every sound around me suddenly alive, like something could step out of the dark at any second. I yanked the door open, scrambled inside, slammed it shut, and locked it without thinking. My breath came hard and fast, my chest heaving as I fumbled for the key. I fired the engine, the roar filling the cab, drowning out everything else. I didn't care about my logbook, didn't care about the violation. I threw it in gear and rolled forward, merging back onto the empty highway like I was being chased. The road stretched out ahead, the white lines flashing under my headlights, and I kept glancing at my mirrors, half expecting to see something there, some shadow running behind me. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was just shadows shifting, maybe I had misjudged where the figure was. But the deeper part of me, the instinctive part, knew what I saw. There had been a figure, and then there wasn't. And in the moment I looked, in the moment my guard was down, it was gone. I drove 40 minutes straight without stopping, my hands tight on the wheel, my throat dry, until the neon glow of a Love's appeared up ahead. The lot was bright, packed with rigs, the noise of engines idling filling the air. I pulled in and parked under the lights, surrounded by people and the comfort of numbers. Only then did I feel the tension start to bleed off. My body shook with the leftover adrenaline, but I was safe, or at least safer, there. That night, I lay in my bunk wide awake, phone dark beside me, every creak and hiss of the truck setting my nerves off. I kept thinking about that empty field. Whether it was a person or a trick of the eyes, I'll never know. But I knew one thing for sure. I was done parking on ramps in the middle of nowhere. No freight, no schedule, no hours of service rule was worth that kind of feeling again. It's been years since that night, and I've kept that promise. I'll park at a truck stop, a rest area, hell, even an overpriced pay lot before I ever put myself out in the middle of a silent ramp beside an empty field again. Whatever was in that cornfield at 3 in the morning, I don't need to know. All I know is I saw something, and then it wasn't there. That's enough to keep me from making the same mistake twice. I wasn't a real trucker, not in the sense of running long hauls across state lines, but I did delivery driving for a few years. I covered wide routes that took me way out into places most people wouldn't bother driving unless they had family there. Some of my stops were deep in the country, miles from the nearest gas station or store, where the roads were quiet enough that you'd start to feel like you were the last person left alive on the planet. There was one customer I had who lived way out between two decent-sized towns. From either direction, it was about a 25-mile stretch of nothing but farmland, tree lines, and the occasional rundown house sitting close to the road. It wasn't a place you'd just stumble across. You either lived there or you were passing through for a reason. I drove that route once a month, regular as clockwork, for almost a year. Every time, I'd get that strange mix of peace and unease that comes with being alone on an empty road for too long. The one consistent landmark out there was a small cluster of old houses set close together on one side of the road. They were falling apart in different stages. Paint peeling, roofs sagging, porches leaning. In the 6+ months I had been driving that route, I never saw a single person around them. No kids, no parked cars, no smoke from a chimney, nothing. They looked completely abandoned, so I always just assumed they were empty shells waiting to finally collapse. One afternoon in the fall, I had a delivery run that put me out on that road again. The season had turned, and the trees along the road had that half-bare look, with leaves piled up in the ditches and scattered across the asphalt. The sky was gray, not stormy, just that dull, heavy kind of gray that makes you feel like the day is shorter than it is. I had been driving for what felt like forever without seeing another car coming toward me. Usually, even on the longest stretches, I'd pass at least one vehicle heading the opposite way, but not that day. Mile after mile went by with nothing but the hum of my tires and the empty fields stretching out on either side. By the time I came up on the group of old houses, I was already on edge from the stillness. My brain had been chewing on it for the last 20 minutes. It's strange how quickly the absence of other people can start to bother you. And that's when I saw her, In the front yard of the most intact of the houses, an old woman was pushing a manual reel lawn mower back and forth over the patchy grass. I almost didn't believe it at first. The sight didn't make sense. Those houses hadn't shown a single sign of life in half a year, and now, out of nowhere, there was someone working the yard like it was the most normal thing in the world. She had gray hair tied back, clothes that looked plain and heavy, and the mower looked ancient, the kind that takes real effort to push. But what hit me hardest was the way she moved. When she saw me coming down the road, she stopped dead in her tracks. She didn't lean on the mower to rest, didn't wipe her forehead, just froze like a deer caught in the beams of my headlights. I immediately eased off the gas, thinking maybe I had been speeding without realizing it. Something about her posture, rigid and intent, made me instinctively slow down. As I rolled past, I glanced at her through the passenger side window. She wasn't looking at the ground or her mower or anything around her. She was staring straight at me, not a casual glance, not just checking out the noise of a vehicle. Her eyes were locked onto me in a way that made the hairs on my arms rise. I kept driving, trying to play it off as nothing, but the unease only deepened. The moment I cleared the house, I flicked my eyes to the rearview mirror. That's when I saw her drop the mower where it stood and turn on her heel to face me as I drove away. Full 180, body stiff, her head tracking me as the distance grew. She didn't move toward the road, didn't wave, didn't go back to mowing. She just stood there, staring, her body twisted so that I could still see her silhouette shrinking in the mirror until the curve of the road finally hid her from view. The rest of that drive out to my customer felt like I had ice water running through my veins. My rational brain tried to explain it away. Maybe she was just curious about who was driving by. Maybe she hadn't seen many vehicles out there lately. Maybe she was eccentric or unwell. But none of those thoughts settled the knot in my stomach. The way she had stopped so suddenly, the way she had turned to keep staring after me, it wasn't curiosity. It was deliberate, unsettling in a way I couldn't shake. When I finished my delivery and turned back the same way, I paid close attention as I came up on the houses again. The yard was empty. The mower was gone. The woman was gone. The place looked just as abandoned as every other time I'd passed it. It was like she'd never been there at all. Over the next 10 months, I made that same run once a month. Every single time when I came to that stretch of road, my chest would tighten and I'd scan those houses carefully. But I never saw her again. No mower, no movement, no people. Just the same lifeless shells I had always assumed they were. The longer it went on, the stranger it felt. Why had I seen her that one single time and never again? Was she passing through, staying temporarily in a house that shouldn't even have been livable? Was she squatting there? Or was it someone who wanted me to see her, to notice her, before vanishing back into the silence of that place? I don't know. All I do know is that from that day forward, those houses stopped being just old buildings on the side of the road. They became a landmark of unease, a reminder that sometimes the scariest moments aren't dramatic or violent. They're quiet, brief, and unexplained. Just one old woman in a place that should have been empty, staring at me until I was gone. When my job eventually changed and I no longer had to drive that route, I was relieved. Not because anything ever happened, but because every time I passed those houses, I could feel the weight of that one encounter pressing down on me. It's been years now, but I still think about it. The abandoned houses, the mower, the woman turning to follow me with her eyes. One strange, frozen moment that has stuck with me longer than any delivery I ever made. I was driving trucks through East Africa during the late 80s and into the early 90s, when things in that part of the continent were tense in ways most outsiders couldn't understand. The roads I traveled weren't like highways elsewhere in the world. Sometimes they were smooth stretches of tarmac, but most of the time they were narrow dirt tracks carved through mountains, forests, and small towns that clung to the roadside. Deliveries meant long days and longer nights, sleeping in the cab, watching the fuel, and always being ready for the unexpected. The unexpected could be anything. A washed-out bridge, a military patrol, a group of armed men who might be police or might just be bandits, or a blown tire in the middle of nowhere. You learn to live with that constant edge to keep your senses sharp. But nothing prepared me for what happened in Rwanda. I had a delivery that took me through the country when the political situation was already deteriorating. You could feel it in the air. Checkpoints had started to appear more frequently, and the people manning them didn't look like trained soldiers. They were young men with mismatched uniforms, some barefoot, all of them carrying weapons that seemed too big for their shoulders. At each stop, I handed over my papers, answered whatever questions I could, and prayed they would wave me through. One afternoon, I came upon another checkpoint. At first, it looked like all the others. Barrels and wood blocking the road, a handful of armed men stopping traffic. But this one was different. The moment I slowed down, one of them raised his rifle and pointed directly at me. I had no choice but to stop. Before I could even shift into neutral, they yanked open the door, pulled me out by my shirt, and shoved me toward a group of other men who were already standing off to the side. The questions came fast, but I didn't understand them. Their language wasn't mine, and my answers only seemed to make them angrier. I tried holding up my ID, showing them where I was from, but they didn't care. They weren't looking at documents. They were looking at me, my face, my body, my features, and from the way their expressions hardened, I realized they thought I was Tutsi. They shoved me through a gate and into a cage made of wooden posts and metal wire, crowded with other men. The ground inside was dirt, hard and uneven, and the smell was heavy, sour, the smell of sweat, fear, and something darker I didn't want to name. Dozens of eyes turned toward me as I stumbled inside. No one spoke my language. No one explained what was happening, but I could see it written on their faces. Hopelessness, resignation, and terror. That first night, I learned the truth. When the sun went down and the air turned cold, the men guarding the cage came with flashlights. They picked out 5 prisoners, pulled them out, and dragged them into the open. There was no trial, no shouting, no words exchanged, just the sound of blades and the screams that followed. I stood there gripping the wire, my body shaking so hard I thought my knees would give out, and I watched 5 men die less than 20 feet from where I stood. I had never seen anything like it in my life, and the sight burned itself into me. The next morning, I was still alive, but the knowledge of what would come hung over me. The guards didn't explain anything. They didn't look at us as people. We were bodies in a pen, and every night, some of those bodies would be chosen and destroyed. I tried again to show my ID through the wire to make them understand, but it meant nothing to them. They didn't read it, didn't care. To them, I was just another prisoner. The second night was worse than the first, because I knew what was coming. I counted the hours as the sun dropped, the shadows stretched, and then the flashlights came again. 5 more men were dragged out. I turned my head away this time, but the sounds still came. The screams, the gurgling, the thud of bodies hitting the dirt. I pressed my face into my hands and tried not to hear, but there was no escaping it. By the 3rd day, I hadn't eaten more than a few scraps of food someone passed me. My throat was dry from fear and from the dust. My mind felt like it was floating above me, unable to hold on. I kept thinking about my truck, my family, the roads I had driven. It felt impossible that my life had come down to this cage, waiting to be chosen. That evening, when the sun was setting again, I noticed one of the men in the cage kept glancing at me. He looked older than most, thin, with lines carved deep in his face. After a while, he came closer, and in a low voice he said a few words of Swahili. My ears snapped to attention. I spoke Swahili, not fluently but enough to understand. I almost broke down when I heard it. In halting words, I explained who I was, that I wasn't Rwandan, that I was a truck driver passing through. I showed him my ID, holding it up under the fading light. He studied it for a long time, then nodded slightly. He didn't say much more, just moved away again. But in that moment, a sliver of hope cut through the darkness that had swallowed me. That night, I lay awake on the dirt, heart pounding, waiting for the guards. When they came, dragging more men out, I thought my turn had come. But then, in the commotion, I saw the man I had spoken to step forward. He said something to the guards in their language, pointing at me, showing them my papers. There was a long pause, a heated exchange I couldn't understand. Then, unbelievably, One of the guards came to the cage and pulled me out. I was shoved toward the gate, heart hammering, expecting a rifle but to the back of my head. Instead, they handed me my keys. My truck was still parked at the checkpoint, dust settling on its hood, waiting for me like nothing had happened. I climbed inside on legs that could barely hold me, started the engine, and rolled away from that place, not daring to look in the mirrors. The road stretched out ahead in the moonlight, endless and empty. I didn't stop driving until I crossed the border, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't even feel the road under me. All I could think of were the men I had left behind, the ones whose faces I still saw every time I blinked. That was the last time I ever drove through Rwanda. After that, I rerouted even if it meant days of extra driving. I never wanted to see those cages again, never wanted to feel the weight of being trapped like that. It's been decades since then, but I still remember it in exact detail. The dust, the wire cutting into my hands, the sound of the blades at night, the face of the man who spoke Swahili and somehow saved me, and the cold weight of the keys in my hand when they gave me back my truck. Some memories stay with you forever, not because you want them to, but because they brand themselves into you. That road, that cage, those nights, I carry them with me still. I don't talk about it much, but when I think back on those years I spent driving trucks through East Africa, the one memory that rises above the rest isn't the long roads, the mountains, or the endless hours behind the wheel. It's the cage. I had seen danger before. That came with the territory. Driving through countries torn by conflict, you learn to expect rough checkpoints, groups of armed men, demands for money or cargo. Most of the time you could get through with a bribe or by being patient or just by luck. But that one trip through Rwanda before the genocide broke out in full was different. It was the closest I ever came to dying, and even though I survived, a part of me stayed in that cage with the others who didn't. I had a delivery to make that took me through the heart of the country. The roads were quiet, almost too quiet, lined with green hills and scattered villages. The sky was bright, the air heavy, and the silence carried a kind of weight. I'd been warned that things were tense there, but I'd driven tense routes before. I figured if I kept my head down and did my job, I'd get through. Then I hit the checkpoint. A makeshift roadblock, barrels and logs dragged across the road. Men with rifles and machetes waving cars down. When they saw me, they didn't ask questions. They dragged me from the cab before I could even get my papers out. The barrels of their guns were close enough to feel the heat of the sun off the metal. They looked at my face, studied me like a butcher looks at an animal before deciding how to cut it. And in their eyes, I saw it. They thought I was Tutsi. I was shoved into a cage with dozens of other men. The walls were rough wood and rusted wire. The ground was dirt, hard and uneven, and the air stank of sweat and blood. Everyone inside looked broken already, eyes sunken, shoulders slumped. I tried to explain in Swahili that I wasn't Rwandan, that I was just passing through, but no one understood me. My words meant nothing. To the guards, I was the same as the rest. That first night, when the sun dropped and the air cooled, they came with flashlights. They opened the gate, pointed, and pulled 5 men out. No words, no ceremony, just 5 chosen at random. We pressed against the wire, silent, waiting. Then the screams started. I had never heard sounds like that before. The machetes came down again and again, and the dirt outside the cage turned dark. I stood frozen, my body trembling so hard my teeth chattered. Even though the night was warm, couldn't look away. Those men died only steps from me, and there was nothing I could do. The second night was worse because I knew it was coming. I counted the hours by the movement of the shadows, by the way the guards' voices rose and fell. I prayed for the dark not to come, but it came anyway. And again, 5 more men were taken. The screams pierced the night, each one stabbing through me. I pressed my hands to my ears but still heard everything. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cage held us all. By the 3rd day, I was hollow. My throat was dry, my stomach cramped from lack of food, but the fear was heavier than the hunger. Every sound made me flinch. Every time a guard passed by, I thought they would unlock the gate and point to me. I thought about my family, about the roads I had driven, about how unreal it felt that I would die here, in the dirt, far from home, with no one even knowing what happened to me. That evening, when the light was fading and the guards were stirring again, a man in the cage spoke to me. His words were broken, halting, but it was Swahili, the first familiar sound I had heard in days. My heart jumped. I told him quickly who I was, that I wasn't Rwandan, that I was just a truck driver. I showed him my ID, my papers, pressing them into his hands so he could see. He nodded slowly, then slipped away into the crowd. I didn't know if it meant anything. I didn't know if he would even try, but for the first time in days, I felt something besides despair. That night, when the guards came again, I thought it was over. They unlocked the gate, shouted, and dragged more men out. But then, suddenly, they pointed at me. My heart stopped. My legs nearly gave out. But instead of dragging me to the line, they shoved me toward the road. One of them pressed my keys into my palm. My truck was sitting there like it had been waiting all along, dust settling on its hood. I climbed into the cab on shaking legs, started the engine with hands that barely obeyed me, and pulled away. The headlights cut through the night, and the road stretched ahead, empty and silent. I drove until the sky lightened, until I was across the border, until I couldn't drive anymore. I survived. But survival isn't the same as being whole. The images never left me. The cage, the men's faces, the screams. For years afterward, I would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, my heart racing, hearing those sounds again. Sometimes I'd be on the road, and a shadow by the side would make my chest seize because for a split second, I was back there, waiting to be chosen. I kept driving for years, but I never went back through Rwanda. I rerouted even when it meant longer trips. I never wanted to risk it again. The memory followed me regardless. You don't see something like that and walk away clean. You carry it. You carry it forever. When I think of it now, decades later, what strikes me isn't just that I survived. It's that most of the men I shared that cage with didn't. Their faces are still with me. Their voices, their silence before the screams. I walked away, but they didn't. And that knowledge sits heavy always. That road taught me something I never forgot. Danger isn't always about accidents or breakdowns. Sometimes it's about being in the wrong place at the wrong time, looking like the wrong person to the wrong set of eyes. And when that happens, all you can do is pray that luck, or a stranger's kindness, will be enough to get you through. I made it out, but the cage never really let me go. I've been on the road for most of my life, and I thought I'd seen just about every danger a trucker could face. Long hours, mechanical failures, thieves on dark highways, even corrupt soldiers shaking you down for bribes. But nothing prepared me for the day I ran into that checkpoint. That was the day I realized just how thin the line is between life and death when you're out there alone, carrying cargo across a land that doesn't care whether you make it or not. I had been hauling supplies across the desert, a long stretch of road that cut through territory most people warned me to avoid. It was one of those jobs where the money was good enough to make you take the risk. The company always said, keep your head down, don't stop unless you absolutely have to, and stay alert. I thought I could handle it. I had driven rough routes before, through war zones, through places where the rules were written by whoever held the guns. But this stretch was worse, and I didn't realize how much until I saw the barricade ahead of me. It looked almost like any other makeshift checkpoint at first. Trucks and cars were pulled over, armed men standing in the road, barrels laid across the asphalt. They were stopping everyone. I slowed down because I didn't have a choice. There were men with rifles pointing straight at me. Behind them, I could see people being lined up, kneeling in the dirt. My stomach dropped before I even reached them. I knew something was very wrong. When they waved me to the side, I parked with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. They dragged me out of the cab and shoved me toward a group of drivers who were already on their knees. The sun was hot on the back of my neck, sweat soaking into my shirt. My legs shook, and I couldn't stop them. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but I understood enough. They were demanding something specific. One by one, the drivers were being tested. They were told to recite. The ones who spoke the right words were shoved aside, rough but alive. The ones who hesitated, the ones who stumbled, the ones who didn't know, those men were shot right there in the dirt. No hesitation, no mercy. I watched it happen. The crack of rifles echoed across the road, and men dropped forward in the dust. Their bodies lay still while the line shuffled closer. The smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and heat. I could barely breathe. I was not from there. I didn't grow up with their words or their divisions. I didn't know the verses they wanted. I didn't even know enough to fake it. All I knew was that when my turn came, they would know in an instant that I didn't belong. And if they knew that, I was dead. I thought about running, just bolting into the desert. But the rifles were everywhere. There was no cover. I'd be cut down before I took 5 steps. I thought about begging, but I'd seen what happened to the men before me who tried that. The rifles answered them the same way. There was no escape, no bargain, no way out that I could see. When the man next to me failed, when his words broke off and he froze, the rifle came up. He fell with a hole in his head, his body folding into the dirt like a sack. I had to look away, but then the guard's hand was on my shoulder, shoving me forward. My knees nearly gave out. I could feel every eye on me. My mouth went dry. My chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. I knew I had nothing. I knew this was the end. My thoughts scattered in 100 directions at once. I thought of my family, the roads I'd driven, the places I'd seen. I thought of my truck sitting just meters away, the keys still dangling in the ignition. It felt cruel that I could be so close to the life I'd built and yet seconds away from losing it all. They barked at me to begin. I froze. The silence stretched, and I knew that silence meant death. My knees shook harder. I couldn't even steady my breath. My mind was blank, completely empty, except for one desperate thought. Do anything. Do something. Don't just kneel here and die. So I made a sound. It wasn't the right sound, not even close. I strung together words I remembered from songs on the radio, from things I'd overheard in markets. Broken, jumbled, nonsense. My voice cracked, trembling, rising and falling in uneven tones. I kept my eyes low, staring at the dirt, forcing my voice not to stop. Every second it kept going. I expected the rifle to crack and end me, but it didn't. When I finally fell silent, the world seemed to hang in the balance. I didn't dare breathe. Then suddenly I was shoved aside. My legs buckled, and I stumbled into the dirt, but I was alive. Couldn't believe it. Somehow, in that moment, they had let me go. I don't remember much about the rest of that day. My body was moving, but my mind was somewhere else. I climbed back into my truck when they waved me off, hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. I drove for hours without stopping. The image of those bodies in the dirt burned into my eyes. I could still hear the gunfire, still feel the heat of the sun on my back, still taste the dryness in my throat. When I finally crossed out of that territory, I pulled the truck to the side of the road and sat there with the engine idling. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. My chest heaved like I had been running for miles. I sat there until the sun went down, trying to convince myself it was over. But it never really ended. Years have passed, and I still see it. When I close my eyes at night, I'm back on my knees in the dirt. I still hear the crack of rifles, still see men drop beside me. I still feel that shove on my shoulder pushing me forward. It doesn't go away. The road is full of dangers. Accidents, thieves, storms, but nothing compares to staring down death in that kind of way. I kept driving trucks after that, but I never went near that route again. I always rerouted, no matter how far out of the way it took me. I knew if I faced another checkpoint like that, I wouldn't be so lucky. Luck saved me once, but luck doesn't come twice on roads like those. And so every time I sit behind the wheel now, I remember that dirt, that line of drivers, that silence before the gunfire. It taught me more about fear than anything else in my life. It taught me that sometimes survival has nothing to do with strength or skill. Sometimes survival is just madness and chance. A moment where you make a sound and pray it's enough to fool the men holding your life in their hands. I drove away that day, but part of me stayed there, kneeling in the dirt with the ones who didn't get back up. I've been on the road long enough to know that late-night hours behind the wheel can play tricks on your mind. Your eyes get heavy, the hum of the engine blends with the tires on the pavement, and your brain starts to wander. But what happened that night in Baltimore wasn't in my head. It was real, and it shook me enough that I still remember every detail all these years later. It was around 3 in the morning, and I was hauling a load through the outskirts of Baltimore. The route took me through an abandoned stretch of highway that always gave me an uneasy feeling. The road cut through industrial areas where the buildings had been left to rot. Warehouses stood with broken windows and rusted gates. Empty lots full of weeds and trash lined both sides, and the overpasses were tagged up with graffiti. Even though the interstate was wide and open, it felt like I was passing through a ghost town. The streetlights in that part of the city were few and far between, and most of them didn't even work. The ones that did flickered, casting a weak orange glow that barely reached the pavement. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy, where even with the windows up and the AC on, you had that feeling like something was pressing down on you. I hadn't seen another vehicle in a long time. No cars, no trucks, nothing. Just me rolling along in the middle of the night, my headlights cutting a tunnel through the darkness. Usually, on a run like that, I'd pick up chatter on the CB, sometimes local drivers, sometimes just static. But that night, my radio had been completely silent. Then, without me touching it, the CB clicked on. The sound of static filled the cab, loud and sudden, like someone had flipped a switch. I froze for a second, staring at it. Sometimes these things get interference, I told myself, no big deal. But then a voice cut through the crackle. "I ain't got no panties on." The voice was low, slow, and drawn out, with a thick southern drawl. It didn't sound playful. It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded deliberate, almost mocking, like the person knew I was listening and wanted to get under my skin. I gripped the wheel tighter and looked out over the road. I could see miles ahead of me, the interstate stretching empty in both directions. No headlights, no taillights, no sign of anyone. Just me. I told myself it had to be some trucker messing around on the channel. Drivers joke on the CB all the time, and sometimes people say weird stuff just to spook others. But the way the words came out didn't sit right with me. There was no laugh, no follow-up, no background noise. Just that one line. I reached over and turned the volume down. For a minute, I drove in silence again, the hum of the engine filling my ears. I tried to push it out of my head, but every time I glanced at the dark shapes of the abandoned buildings along the highway, I imagined someone standing inside, radio in hand, staring out at me as I passed. A few miles later, the radio crackled again. I hadn't touched it since turning the volume down, but the knob twisted like it had a mind of its own, clicking back up to full volume. My chest tightened. Static filled the cab again. Then the same voice came through. "Can you see me?" This time the words were drawn out even longer, deep and slow, like someone was whispering right into my ear. My stomach flipped. I scanned the mirrors, the road behind me, the fields of broken concrete and weeds to either side. Nothing. Not a single vehicle, not a single person. Just empty highway. I thought about pulling over to check the CB, maybe even shutting it off completely. But I didn't dare. Stopping on that stretch of road, in the middle of abandoned Baltimore at 3 in the morning, felt like the last thing I should do. So I kept my foot steady on the accelerator, trying to put distance between me and whatever was happening. The voice didn't come back right away. For about 10 minutes, all I heard was static. I started to calm down a little, thinking maybe it was just some stray signal bleeding through, something that had caught me at just the wrong moment. Then the radio popped again, louder this time, like someone had smacked the mic on the other end. My whole cab filled with static, sharp and violent. And then, clear as day, "I'm right behind you." I swear my heart nearly stopped. I shot my eyes to the mirrors so fast my neck cracked. But the road behind me was pitch black, completely empty. Not a single pair of headlights in sight. My breathing went shallow. I forced my foot down harder on the pedal. The truck wasn't built for speed like a car, but I pushed it as much as I dared. The engine roared, the tires hummed louder, the vibration in the wheel grew. All I could think was get out, get away, get to somewhere with lights and people. Every second felt like an hour. My eyes flicked from mirror, to the road ahead, to the CB sitting on the dash. I half expected to see a face staring back at me from the reflection in the glass. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw a glow in the distance, a cluster of lights breaking the darkness. A truck stop on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place with fuel pumps, a diner, and a lot full of rigs parked nose to tail. Civilization, safety. I didn't let up until I pulled into the lot, the lights flooding over me like a wave. Trucks sat lined up, drivers milling around, a few cars parked by the diner. The place looked alive, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I let myself breathe. I pulled into a spot, cut the engine, and sat there in the sudden silence. My hands were still shaking on the wheel. I looked at the CB. The radio was dead quiet. No static, no voice, nothing. Just a lifeless box sitting on the dash. I left it off the rest of the night. After that, I couldn't shake the memory of that voice. The way it seemed to know I was out there alone. The way it turned a simple machine into something sinister. I told myself it was just a prank, some local messing with truckers passing through. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That voice wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was timed, deliberate, and aimed right at me. To this day, when I'm on an empty stretch of road in the early hours of the morning, I keep my CB turned off. Some drivers say that's dangerous, that you need it for warnings and chatter. But I don't care. I'd rather miss a heads up about a speed trap or a pothole than hear that voice again in the middle of the night. Because once you've had silence broken by something that shouldn't be there, you realize just how vulnerable you really are out on those dark highways. And for me, that was enough to change the way I drive forever.